Shabbat Shalom. So before I sort of get into what I really kind of have in mind, I've spoken not infrequently over the last 10 and a half years or so about the difficulty of translation, right? And I came across, as I was looking at Hallel this morning, and I glanced over to the English translation. I mean, I don't look at the English translation of the Siddur that frequently, but I glanced over, and we have in Hallel, Pithuli Sharei Tzedek Avovam Odeya. Zeh Hashar Ladonai Tzadikim Yavovo. Right? Open for me Sharei Tzedek, the gates of Tzedek. Right? And it says, open for me the gates of triumph. Right? I mean, you don't have to know a lot of Hebrew to know. If I said, what does the word tzedek mean? Right? It's in a famous phrase, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, right? Justice, justice shall you pursue, right? So why does it say, this is Pithuli Sharei Tzedek? Translation should be, open for me the gates of justice, right? But it says, open the gates of triumph, okay? And I saw another translation, I remember when I was in rabbinical school, believe it or not, I sang in a chorus for a performance of Hallel, and there was some English, and it said, open the gates of victory for me, okay? Triumph, victory, right? And then it says, Zeh Hashar Ladonai, this is the gate to Adonai, Tzadikim Yavo'uvo, right? The righteous shall enter it. Tzedek Tzadikim. Right? So why does it say, why does the English say, for sure, it's not gates of victory or gates of triumph? Okay? It's not a mistranslation, right? It's not like Rabbi Harlow didn't know Hebrew well enough, right? I mean, why is Sharei Tzedek the gates of victory or the gates of triumph? Alan.
Well, justice is a divine attribute, and justice is more than just the lady holding the scales. So it is a victory if justice prevails. It is a victory if the righteous are able to impose their standards. So that's the victory. That's the triumph.
Right. Right, and I think that's right. And I mean, I wasn't really meaning to mention this, but if you think about the verdict in the Alex Jones trial, right? I mean, I will go out on a limb and say that those families will not get $965 million, right? I mean, I think it is frankly more likely that they get $0 than that they get $965 million. Okay, although I think in reality, they will get something more than 0, but less than 965 million, right? But it's still a victory, right? They feel vindicated. And another translation that is sometimes used for tzedek is vindication. Right? Well, if you said, open for me the gates of vindication, I don't know, but the idea is that righteousness and victory, righteousness and triumph are somehow connected, right? And that tzaddik is not just a righteous person, he's also a victor, if that's God's will, right? And that's what we pray for. And the reason that I say that, Alan, and again, this was not a setup, because you spoke about righteousness as an attribute of God, right? And that's the whole gist of the reading this morning, is that God, Moses kind of has a meltdown a little bit, right? He has a meltdown a little bit, and hard to blame him, right? I mean, he's trying to lead Jews, right? That's not an easy task. Okay, so he has a bit of a meltdown, and he says, I'm not, you know what? I want to hand in my resignation, right? And unless I can see your kavod, okay, which again, this is a word that many of us know. Kavod means what? Honor or glory, right? But the English translation is God's presence, okay, which also I think is true because we see a lot in both the Torah and the prophetic books that the kavod Adonai fills the temple. Kavod Adonai fills the tabernacle, and nobody can go into the tabernacle because it's filled with the kavod of Adonai. Okay, it's filled with God's presence, right? And so Moses essentially says, you know what, I've spoken to you, I've never seen you, right? I've never seen you. I want to know that you're real. I want to know that you're with me. I want to see you. And God says, well, special for today for you, right? Special today for you. I don't know why God has an Israeli accent, but he does, right? No one can see my face, but for you, I show you my back. Okay? No one can see my face, but I'll show you my back. Okay, now I have another question. What the heck does that mean? Can't see my face, but I'll show you my back. You've all been reading this longer than I have, okay? Although maybe not as frequently. Yeah, D.
This is not, I'm sure, what you're looking for, but the thing puzzles me because in my learning, God is, I don't know if the word is amorphic that I'm looking for, but he doesn't have any human body. So I know you're looking more for the, I'm sorry?
Incorporeal.
Okay, but I know that we've come to know that his countenance, his face is what everybody is craving, but I don't see why that would be more tangible than what Moses was asking for.
Okay, anybody else?
I think we talked about before the back, the not seeing God's face, but him turned around, is you can see what happened. You know what happened. That was kind of the explanation we've talked about before.
Right.
Right. No, that's right. I mean, I've mentioned this before, right? Is that I think it means that you can't, and I think the text justifies what I'm about to say, is that you cannot see the being of God because God is incorporeal, okay? Although perhaps, it's hard to say, right? Because we have a lot of anthropomorphisms in the Torah, right? Even in this very reading that God says, stand in this cleft in the rock and I'll cover you with my hand until I've passed by, right? And in the book of Exodus, we have a lot about the hand of God, right? Now, at that time, did they believe that the hand of God literally meant that? I don't know, okay? But by the time of the rabbis, right? And our theology is the rabbi's theology, right? God is incorporeal, right? As we sing every Friday night, Ein lo demut haguf ve'eino guf, right? He doesn't have the appearance of a body, and he's not a body, right? So if you want to literally see God, you can't, okay? But you can see God's work in the world, right? And you maybe don't know that God is here at the time, but you look back and you see God's action, right? I mean, it's a little bit, I tend to not go in for these, corny poems and memes and stuff like that, right? But, and I don't remember the whole thing, but there's this thing about, sometimes there's two sets of footsteps in the sand, and sometimes there's only one set of footsteps, and the one set of foot is when I carry, right? And we feel that sometimes, right? We go through a really hard time, and then we look back and suddenly we're better, right? And how did that happen? And I don't necessarily mean physically, but emotionally too. How did that happen? That's the work of God. That's the work of God. What is the vehicle for that work of God? Human beings, right? Could be our doctor, could be our friends in our community that reached out when we were in pain and lifted some of that pain, right? I mean, it says, you visit a sick person, you take away a 40th of their suffering, right? So we can detect God's presence only in retrospect. We can't see God, but we can see the evidence of God's action. And that's what God says to Moses after he says, I'll show you my back. He says, I'll show you my grace and my goodness. I'll show you my grace and my goodness, right? And when we try to talk about God, right, this is the problem that every philosopher, Jewish, whether you talk about Maimonides, whether you talk about Augustine, whether you talk about, the great Islamic, the Mutakalimun, you try to talk about God, and you're faced with the limits of human language and human comprehension, right? I mean, I spoke on Yom Kippur about how to know what God wants, right? And sometimes people say, well, Rabbi, why did God this or that? Or what is God? And like, if I fully understood God, right? And this is not me. I'm not sure who said it first, frankly, but I think it was probably a German. If I understood God, I would be God. Right? If I understood God, I would be God. We are finite, flawed. God is infinite and perfect, right? And that's what God is saying, right? You can't comprehend my very essence, but you can know me through the things I do, right? And that's, I mentioned both Maimonides and St. Augustine. They both talk about what's known as the via negativa, right? To define God is to limit God, which is idolatrous. So we use only negative attributes about God. God is not evil, God is not corporeal, etc., etc. Right? And a modern update of that, Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who passed away not so many years ago, a prominent conservative rabbi in California, call this predicate theology, right? We talk about things as being godly, right? Right? As instead of saying God feeds the hungry, we say feeding the hungry is godly, right? Instead of God feeds the prisoners, freeing prisoners is godly, right? And we have that in a lot of midrashim, which say something like Mahu af atah, right? Just as he is, so should you be, right? And then they give all these examples of, God clothes the naked. Okay, when did God clothe the naked? He sewed breeches for Adam and Eve, right? When they were naked, right? God visits the sick. How do we know? When Abraham was recovering from his circumcision at 80 years old, God sent 3 angels to visit him, etc. Right? That the urge is, as I said, to be sort of God's agents and God's messengers in the world. And maybe by doing that, we can in fact come to understand God a little bit more closely. So those are my thoughts. Anybody has comments or questions? Those of you who had comments already, much appreciated, but if there are more, please, happy to hear them. Not? Okay. Wait a second.